Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and today is the 1st of January 2018. It's interesting. My experience of the transitioning of one year to the next was really uneventful. I was doing research actually, looking in a sense into the future was what was of more interest to me. However, I hope everybody had a wonderful time and are enjoying their holidays. Really, ultimately, it's about being with yourself and living your life out of what makes you happy, even if it does appear to be a short period of time before people go back to work or back into the routine of a structure that's been created prior to our birth. And before I talk about the future, in a sense, I might just meditate a little bit just to sort of become still, relax, and connect inwardly, because I've always been an adherent of the belief that all wisdom comes from within. You can never learn it in books. It has to come from within. And I guess wisdom is always in the eye of the beholder. If somebody acknowledges or experiences some form of wisdom, then that wisdom has served a purpose. If they haven't, well, that's fine. It's just words. And I like that too. I love the humility of things being just what they are, with no real story attached. So I'll breathe in, breathe out, breathe in love, breathe out joy, breathe in peace for this planet, breathe out excitement in every moment to live fully. As I'm sort of, in a sense, becoming still, I felt myself sort of scanning the world, like what is happening with the world. And of course, as everybody knows, there's great change going on right now. And has been for a while, actually. The 1980s comes to mind. That was actually when the decline of the United States started in a more visible way. In truth, probably from after the Second World War, when there was that great expansion of rebuilding, which fueled economic growth, particularly in the United States, as the UK passed the banner to the US in respect of being a world power. And of course, since Second World War, of course, we've seen many changes to power dynamics around the planet, with the fall, of the Berlin Wall, demise of Soviet era, the Asian tigers emerging with really fundamental economic growth over the 80s and 90s, the rise of China as it could utilise cheap labour and copy much of the technologies that it then reproduced in the Asian region. We've even seen, Central and South America, particularly South America, also expanding, and India. As capital has been available, it's the availability of capital that has enabled countries to industrialise. And multinational companies, of course, have expanded beyond nation states, reaching across the globe. Some multinational companies having all their componentry made in different parts of the world, as they compile it in one place that would have either no tax or cheap labour, as they minimise all costs to maximise profit, which has always been the mantra of the economic religion of profit maximisation. And it is a religion. It's very much an unquestioned one, and one that most people are linking their hats to and thinking that this is security. And others would certainly argue, and if you've looked into some history, you'll see it hasn't really been that long ago that people have lived very frugal lives. I can remember my grandmother's generation, they had milk delivered, in bottles. My other friend's mum was telling me how they kept their food cold in a sort of a storage unit. Some of them were called the Coolgardie safes, that were a very primitive form of, certainly it wasn't electronic, it was a safe that used the wind, if you like, coming through that design in order to cool food down. So it wasn't refrigeration. My friend's mother told me about how they used kerosene lamps to light their houses. Work was hard, particularly after during the Second World War, and things slowly built up after. And we had, of course, the 60s, that were this sort of bursting forth of desires for freedom as economic growth, sort of expanded exponentially. We had the hippie movement around that time, where people were really experiencing love and free love and freedom and speaking up, exercising democratic rights, certainly in Western countries. We've also seen the rise of control around the planet. Interestingly enough, in my own lifetime, I've certainly seen it. I came from fairly free origins. Luckily for me, in my early life, I had a lot of freedom. So I know what that experience is like, and that creates what I would call self-determination, where you start to follow your own rhythm. This is taking one's power back in a system that's highly conforming. And of course, harmony with that system is great as well. I can work in harmony with that system, but I'm also very conscious of my own independence and interdependence as I observe a world in great change and various psychological dispositions arising due to enormous pressures placed on people. People feeling unable to cope with life as families break apart through economic and personal changes. Some may say that the fact that a welfare state was available enabled women to break the nexus with men, where they were dependent on men. I'd say there's truth in that. And then women themselves felt pressured to work, which then broke the nexus with children, which is very problematic. But at the same time, if I flip that over, we are all sort of, in a sense, being cut loose from a system that's no longer serving the highest good of the planet. It's a little bit like the story of the emperor with no clothes, who gets convinced by these tricksters that, they make him these invisible clothes, and they go, "Oh, it's beautiful what you're wearing, Your Majesty. These are the finest threads." Convince him that he's wearing the most beautiful clothing and is naked. And what's interesting about that story is he moves through the streets and everyone cheers him and pretends that he's wearing clothes. No one says a word, because that's the conformity. Nobody wants to step out and speak the truth to power, because they're afraid that he might react negatively and it may be detrimental to them. So everyone looks at everybody else and they conform in this, in a sense, consensus of silence. And it's only the children that go, "Oh, he's naked," because they haven't been trained to be silent. They see what is, and then they just say something. And that's when the king realised he had no clothes, through the eyes of children who see clearly. And what this is really metaphorical for is he has no power in reality. The only real power on the planet comes from love. And this is loving each other, looking after nature. Doing what you love is enormously empowered, as you will do whatever is needed in order to reach that objective, that dream. Love is very underrated on the planet. It's seen as in very narrow wafers of romance. It's not understood as a universal concept, or it's not even really a concept, it's a feeling. And once you start to reach out into the world and you look at all these other people, and if you see them as family, you will feel empowered to act. Our belief system that separates us off from one another is what's leading us down this path of greed, because we think there's not enough, or we're not enough is the true projection of greed, which reflects ego, the ego consciousness. When you start to unravel your own life as you're seeking to be who you are, as you are, you start to realize that we're all connected, one way or another. You start to realize that what you do for another, you do for yourself. There is no separation. And if you project an enemy onto anybody, it always returns. The very energy that you've directed at that person comes back to you in one way or another, because we're all connected. Life is circular. So what we do in respect of ourselves and our relationships, with our children, with our neighbours, with our society, with different ethnic groups, different religious groups, whatever that dividing feature is, when we focus on that, it diminishes the whole. When we accept that diversity and difference, not as a catchphrase or because everybody else is saying that, but an actual integral change within yourself, where you actually look upon the world as an aspect of yourself. This is what oneness projects into life. It's also the underlying reality. We're all connected and we're all one. And some might say, well, what does that mean, we're all one? It means energetically we're all connected. And anyone can see that when you walk into a room. You can feel it, that there's connection happening. We're human beings. It's part of the human condition to connect to one another. The isolation of human beings is what we call bullying or exclusion. Certainly in primitive times, maybe that other was excluded because of disease, or maybe they were banished because of behaviour. But in the progressive type of worldview, no one is excluded. Everyone is included. And there's no more punishment in that worldview. There is only a consequence to one's own actions. And life brings that anyway. Guilt brings that to people when they've done the wrong thing, and they know that it's wrong because it doesn't feel good for them. And when it doesn't feel good for them, that simply means that they've come out of alignment with their own truth. That's all it is. When we feel bad, it means we're in a lie on some level. Powerlessness is another one. We're still learning about what real power is on this planet. We still think it's augmenting ourselves by status, money, material things, education, how we look. We've augmented that as sort of things that we've placed around ourselves to give a certain perception of who we are. And we've called that power because others have responded to some degree in admiration of that, subservience to that, feeding that one way or another. But the real power actually exists within sharing, caring, revealing, and healing. This is when we really are being our true selves, in harmony with one another, when we see their pain as my pain. Although I don't take on their pain and suffer for them, I just, through empathy, can feel that other is suffering, and that moves me. I had a friend contact me overnight who's been in the hospital over New Year. Her daughter's not well. And she's asked for me to help her. So I feel deeply for her situation. I don't know what that situation is like. I've never had that situation happen to me. But I can feel her exhaustion. And this is a person I greatly admire. She's a person who really perseveres for goals that she believes in that will serve humanity. She's incredibly strong. She's got 3 children that she's raised. She's very selfless. I've never met anyone like her. She's incredible. I've never seen anyone work as hard as her. So after I finish this video, I'll be going over to give her a hand. And she's got an elderly mum, so I'll cook for her mum. This is what empathy does. We're talking 2008 and the future ahead. Empathy has to become a core principle of how we configure humanity through social policies. What I've seen is economic policies overtaking social policies, as if the society will take care of itself, like a trickle-down effect, which was an original economic prey, that if we allow economic growth to take place, the crumbs fall off the table. It's an extraordinarily simple viewpoint. Obviously, no concept of looking after elderly parents or the disabled. No concept of increasing illness in society due to overworking, stress, separation, mental health issues, due to this feeling of isolation that most people feel, in truth. Even in a crowd, they're feeling isolated. Even surrounded by friends, they feel misunderstood. The technology, such as the iPhones, is a very important point in respect of social isolation. They're all on their phones. They're not even looking at each other. That's a real problem, and that's going to be the basis of a mental health issue, because healthy social interaction and dialogue is what gives you a sense of esteem. It gives you a sense of connectedness. It gives you a sense of mutual understanding and respect. And of course, respect is a word not well understood either, which will have to become a central idea in the future if we're going to try and work out peace on this planet. I do look upon my own planet as very primitive. I'll be honest with you, I do. Because I know that we can do a lot better than this. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that a lot of people don't feel that empowered enough to be able to usher in something new. But we do need to start working on a new way of living and being together. The day of nuclear flashpoints has to end. This has to be banned actually worldwide. It is not keeping us safe. And as we can see in the current political configurations around the world, it's actually very threatening to the planet and us. If the person doesn't have a sense of wisdom or proportion or a sense of sensitivity in respect of how that other communicates, if that other has a worldview that it thinks is the only worldview, then that then becomes a more totalitarian perspective, which is intolerant to challenges. And of course, the whole democratic principle was around sharing viewpoints and becoming empowered through the diversity and contrast of those viewpoints so that we can stretch beyond what we thought. This is the stretching beyond belief. But if you stay within your narrow box of belief and you say this is the world, you're wrong. It's not. It's your world based on what you see, all the mix of experiences that have become filters to how you see the world is uniquely your own perspective. Everyone comes from a unique perspective. And even though we go out and we do research, and yes, there seems to be a collaborative view on certain issues where others are in agreement, or we have research published that others go, yes, that sounds right. Ultimately, it's all conceptual. The real knowledge comes from experience, actually going through things. And because in this day and age, we're not having multiple experiences of expertise. During the Enlightenment, not only were they scholars, they were musicians. They had various other trade skills, languages, really broad-based, developing the whole person. Philosophy was very key, the sciences. But what we have today is very narrow educations where we have a certain expertise, but outside of that, we have no idea. And if we're constantly working without having this life experience pervading our everyday experience, we become very narrow-minded, very rigid in our beliefs. And any challenge to that, which under a normal circumstance would be welcomed, is not welcomed. It's seen as some sort of threat, and then we defend against that threat. Then we will see that other in a certain light, and then we will bring others around us in order to remove that problem, because it doesn't feel good. But as I said earlier on in this discussion, the not feeling good is actually when you're out of alignment with truth. That's actually how it works. And I'm talking from a humanistic perspective. This is the innate human being feels bad when they're out of alignment with their truth. Life happens from moment to moment to moment to moment. If you live fully within each moment, you will feel peace. If you're projecting a future, if you have fears that you're projecting onto that future, you will relive it and relive it. But in reality, it's not here. It's always out there. It's never happened. And when it does finally arrive, it'll unfold in a different way. And if we cling to the past, same thing applies. We keep reliving the past. That's why I'm very much for solutions, very much problem-solving perspective. I don't believe in blaming anyone. I think that people are operating out of what they understand. I don't dislike anyone. And I've had some good reason to, but I don't. Because I am not in their shoes, see? And this is what the peace perspective empowers within me, is an awareness that I'm not in their shoes. I do not know how they feel. I am not having their experience. From their perspective, it seems the most rational choice, probably. Or irrational. I've met a few that are that. Whatever it is, that is their experience. It's not mine. So again, looking forward to the future, if we are going to have a planet that survives, and my hope would be thrives, we have to undo a lot of patterning that has not served us. If it's bringing us into more misery and creating more misery for others, if it's excluding others, if it's impoverishing some at the expense of others, if fairness is no longer valued as another core principle, then we lose the root of justice and law, which is what law actually arose out of, was to try and negotiate settlements, to try and divert people from violence into the court system. And certainly the early tribal societies had their own councils where they would hear grievances and deal with it. But when you're deeply trained or educated in more of a peace philosophy, you can make a lot of space for other people. This is what compassion creates, space. It's allowing that feeling aspect of caring for other human beings without story about, whether they're good or bad or whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm still going to be who I am, which is a caring and compassionate human being towards others. I will always give of myself without expecting return, although, I may well request or at least try to inspire others to acknowledge that there are more people involved in situations. Empathy, of course, would lead us towards feeling for that other. And this is what creates the real security and social stability, is when we actually care for one another and we care about outcomes. But we've become very disconnected, and this is one of the key problems that humanity is facing today. We're emotionally disconnecting from each other. Societies and if you like, human habitation has become too concentrated in cities, and it's dehumanised people. And of course, when we've got a media circulating violent images all the time, peppered with some stories here and there that might have social interest, but for the most part, there's a theme of violence that seems to run through the media, which I see as a form of social conditioning. And it creates more and more fear within people of each other. And I find that very concerning, because it means that they go to places they won't feel safe. I come out of a peace perspective, so I feel safe. I feel safe on planes. I'm not afraid. I will deal with the situation in the moment if it is to happen, but I'm not going to cut off or pinch off aspects of my own lived experience due to unfounded fears, coming from a paradigm that is increasing and ratcheting up fear at the expense of harmony. Whenever I hear stories of violence, I always reflect on how many stories there would have been of peace and love, where people have actually helped each other, where they haven't been violent, but they've been kind and compassionate, where they've shared food, where they've taken someone in who was homeless, where a politician has given something anonymously without anyone knowing. Where a woman's been treated with respect and love, or a man has been treated with respect and love by someone else. These are the stories we'll never hear. We'll never hear about the heroism of people who are actually putting themselves last and helping someone else first. And yet these things are happening all the time in this world. But unfortunately, because of the cherry picking of media, we're seeing a perspective, and it's being constantly repeated as an operant conditioning. And that is framing the world we see, and it is also creating the future that's coming. I've come into the peace area through inspiration. I dreamed I was teaching peace. I moved out of economics and market research. And that was because of the dream that I had. I would have stayed in research ignorant, like many others. But the dream took me out of that security, if you like, into a life that became less secure in terms of physical. In terms of emotional, I became more secure. I'm actually very secure inside. But that inspiration for peace, I know, can change the world. I absolutely have no doubt about that. If this became a sort of an operating paradigm on the planet, that peace education was taught first, not accounting, not maths, but learning about yourself, learning how to this is not about managing anger. I don't believe in anger management. I believe in changing the thought process, because we believe our thoughts absolutely as if it's a mantra. We believe it, that we're right, they're wrong. As soon as we do that, we create division. Then we diminish the other in some way through labels. This is not about reconciliation or peacemaking. And with peacemaking, one of the priorities, if you like, of it is to know thyself and be true. And of course, people make mistakes, innocent mistakes as well. But it is to have an intention for truth. And this is not an idealistic notion. It is very important if you're going to be able to live with who you are. If you cannot be honest to yourself, then you cannot be honest to anyone else. If you feel you have to convey a line to keep yourself safe, and even if that meant making another unsafe, that will return to you. And see, from a peace perspective, what goes around comes around, definitely. This is a precept, definitely. And it happens because life is energy. I've looked at peace from many dimensions and directions. I've looked at it from a spiritual perspective in terms of virtues, things like respect. These are not just words. You have to respect yourself first, then you will respect others and you will never demean them. And if you are doing that, it means something within you doesn't respect you, because life is a mirror. That's how the peace perspective sees. Life is a mirror. We're all on journeys. Sometimes people have extremely hard lives, and I certainly wouldn't say that's just simply karma. You know, they've in previous life they've not done the right thing. I would say they're here to learn something. That's why they're going through the experience. It's here for a purpose. And you can either fight the experience or you can be grateful for the experience for what it's teaching. We may not condone actions that others engage in, but we understand that from a peace perspective, this is an opportunity to know myself and be true. And it's an opportunity to drop a story about others. Those contrasts, as I've talked about in the past, are here to help us reach into ourselves to become more authentic human beings rather than living superficial narratives that we've all been trained to talk. To be real is to really look at people in the eye and say the truth. Nothing frees you more than the truth. And the fears that you may carry about revealing truth are never true. It is intensely a truism that the truth sets us free. Now, this is not a perspective. It's going into yourself, feeling for your own truth, and communicating as best you can. And of course, words can never be the truth. Those of us in a peace perspective know that. Words are truncations of truth. Feeling is a closer interpretation of truth, because you can feel if something feels good or not. And it's usually instant. You don't have to think it through. The intellect in reality is to serve the inner truth or love of the human being. That's the peace perspective. We see the intellect in service of the heart, if you like, is one way of putting it. The Egyptians had a heart-based intelligence that they used in their civilization. Civilizations have come and gone, and those who have really fallen are those that have always built up power. They've concentrated power in a few hands and used force and control in order to keep that power. It never works. Gandhi talked about, the tyrants, he called them. This was in the Attenborough movie. If you ever want to watch it, it's well worth looking at. He said, empires rise and fall. He says, always they fall. He says, remember this, always they fall. And the reason they fall is because they're not based on truth. They're based on philosophies, on histories, on perspectives, various organisations, in order to get people to behave in certain ways to serve that civilization. We see the same with economic systems, capitalist system around the planet. But always it falls when it's out of harmony with its own inner truth. And this is why humanities is essential. It should be taught at all universities as a priority. Because when we detach from our humanity, we're not able to fully function, to, if you like, develop higher intelligences that are going to serve humanity. We have to have an understanding of humanity in order to serve it. Why do we want to serve it? Because if we don't serve it, it collapses. Sum of the parts exceeds the whole when you see others as yourself and you expand upon that. Humanities is not a wishy-washy statement. Everything that's been created is serving human beings on one level or another. The humanity is what we share innately with one another. We are human. Now we can fight against the humanness of others, or we can come into some form of understanding the humanness of others. It may be different from mine, but that doesn't negate its value. I've travelled around the world and I've met a lot of people in a lot of cultures, and from a different perspective. When I was dressed as a clown, clowning on the street, I got to look into the shared humanity. And I saw nothing but beauty in that. And there was enormous joy inherent in that recognition of myself meeting the humanity in another, which was the same as myself. That is why what you see in another is yourself. And this intimacy is into me see. When you're real, you will see. It's a different way of seeing, but it's seeing more clearly with clarity. And therefore I cannot go about this world hurting other people to serve my own self-interest, because ultimately I hurt myself. They are connected to me. Deep within myself, if I'm honest, I would know. But what people typically do is they divert their attention away from those uncomfortable feelings of recognition that I've done some harm. And they will divert it through narratives that justify hurting other people, making them pay, excluding them from the rest of society. Because we're not prepared to look into ourselves and see what it is that has caused us a feeling of discord where we've blamed it on another. And that's not to say others do not, inflict harm on that person suffers. Of course they do. I'm talking about this perpetual hurting of others around the world that we're seeing, which is grounded in self-interest. But it's a disconnected self-interest. It's not the self-interest that wants to maximize its potential, or the self-interest that seeks its own happiness. That's fine. That is an integrated humanity, aware of self and showing interest. I'm talking about the self-interest that cuts out everyone else, that's only interested in what it's doing and doesn't really care. There's an indifference to the suffering of others. And again, as I said earlier on, we don't have to take on board the suffering of others and make it my own pain. We don't want to create more pain. There's no loyalty in taking on the pain of your people or your family or your partner or your children. You're only adding to the greater misery. What people in pain require actually is more positivity around them. They need to feel there's hope. They need to believe in their own ability to turn their lives around. Nobody wants handouts. I often hear terminologies like entitlement when it comes to welfare, and it's totally untrue. There may well be patterns that have been built up over generations where people are used to receiving welfare payments, but it's not a question of blaming this person or the other. It's to see this as a pattern, and is it serving that person? Compassion would ask the question, is it serving them? How do we assist in empowering that other to really experience their full power? All people want to feel power. They do not want to be dependent on anybody because it's a weakened state. But disempowerment can be in the interests of some who want to see people dependent. There's also justification for their existence if they make someone dependent on them. But the true love empowers everyone to find what's true within themselves. And what we would want is their happiness. And that might come, through a challenge. If you really care about people, you will speak your truth to them, even if they don't like it. Because you can see this is not going to serve them. If they're engaged in toxic behaviours, it's not going to serve them. There's also spiritual reality to this. It doesn't serve them spiritually. And that's another discussion. The spiritual side of life is a real world as well. And we all experience that spiritual world when we feel love. It's coming innately from within us. But if we're going out into the world and demanding it, you will never get it. You will always feel empty. So the love has to come from within yourself. You have to be the source of that very thing that you think that you need. You don't. It's inside you. We are all, in many respects, teachers. The only question would be is what is it that you are seeking to teach? So 2018 is going to be a year of even greater transition. The climate is most definitely changing. I'm certainly experiencing this rapid change like I've not felt before. Hailstones in December, cold, weather's been quite cold, and then we get it really hot. It's like a fever. You can feel that the planet is listing. And I sit back and I observe this continual hamster wheel, because that's what it is. People are just running on the wheel. They don't know how to get off. This is all they know. But I've been marvelling for probably 20 years now at, when first the climate issue was raised, and I saw all this argument against it, and then we had the skeptics. They've all gone quiet, I know. But they were just industrialists who didn't want to change. And the selfishness of that is the implication for the next generation. They didn't consider at all. It's just about let's make profits now. And that mentality still exists today with corporations still extracting, still engaged in activities that add to the imbalance on the planet or the climate changes, earth changes, with absolutely no connection to those they impact. Business as usual, it's been called. But fortunately, the planet itself will force us to change, and it will. We're not the ultimate power on this planet. And that change is to make us look at what we do, is to make us question why we do what we do, and does it bring ultimately the happiness that it was promised in the very beginning. Economics always promised happiness. If you do this, then you'll be happy, you'll make lots of money and retire. Well, that's not happening anymore. Greed took root because people had not dealt with their inner world. They were seeking to impress others. They wanted to feel larger than life. They got seduced by the power. They saw others subservient to them, making them feel bigger and bigger. When people give lip service to people in power, they're not serving them. The kindest thing you can do to someone in power is tell them the truth for their own sake. It gives them a sense of perspective and proportion. You can lose all sense of reality if you're constantly being given positive reinforcement when your behaviours may well be problematic. And the person does it because they don't want to be sacked or they don't want to be in disfavour. Their self-interest governs that conformity, if you like. The highest kindness, in my view, is telling the truth. The highest respect is being truthful to people. You're not trying to create some image. You're saying it as you see it. And if there's any error in that, well, if people are engaged in honest, connection, relationship, discourse, then that matter can be understood more clearly from embracing the various perspectives being offered. But at the moment on the planet, we're dealing with mindsets that are investing in their own perspective and negating others, or they're investing in their own culture, believing it's superior and another is inferior when it's not. So until the family starts to recognise itself in each other and comes together with respect, with empathy, with compassion, with love, and speaks truthfully to one another, then we're in a position to turn the ship around, and it is very much akin to the Titanic. Although in this case, the ice is melting. So with that, what I would encourage the world, and I certainly feel optimistic, I'm not a pessimist about the future, I'm not a pessimist about anything. I have my moments, but for the most part, I'm always in a state of gratitude. I'm breathing. This is great. I have a roof over my head. That's wonderful. And, the treasure of friends that love me and that I love. This is abundance. I know the true wealth. I live it every day. So what I leave with you in 2018 and beyond is to know thyself and be true and do what makes you happy. Bye.